Okay, everybody, I think we'll get started now. It's my great pleasure to introduce my colleague Mike Rapport, who's also a colleague of many of us here, and to listen to the fruits of the research that he's been doing since he joined us. Mike is a hugely distinguished figure within the history of modern France. He has contributed 3 very substantial research monographs that are all of them reference points in our field. Without question, there's a book published in 2000 about citizenship, the nature of citizenship. I'll give you the exact title here. Nationality and Citizenship in Revolutionary France, the Treatment of Foreigners, which is a subject, as we all know, that is back on the news agenda nowadays. He has also written a study of 1848 in the mainly revolutionary France. It's a year of revolution, but of course the revolutions across Europe. And most recently, he has written the book about which we're going to hear today, Rebel Cities, Paris, London, and New York in the Age of Revolution, which appeared in 2017. I don't want to say much more about Mike's remarkable talents, other than the fact that he is as good or better than any colleague I've ever had. He's a wonderful colleague and hugely enthusiastic and supportive, and I'm very honored to introduce him today to give this humanities lecture. Mike, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Peter, for that really generous introduction. Thank you. And thank you, everybody, for coming. Or salut et fraternité, as they used to say in the year 2 of the Republic. Before I begin, this is André Chénier's house. He was a poet and journalist, guillotined on the last day of the Terror. Nearly survives. And his house has become this rather iconic structure in Paris. Because of the way the streets now are kind of like the Flatiron Building in New York in miniature. On the 28th of October, 1793, the meeting of the Society of Revolutionary Republican Women opened as usual in the crypt of the Church of Saint-Eustache at Les Halles, the central food markets in Paris. Women sporting the red Phrygian bonnet of liberty were still arriving when there was a ruckus coming down the stairs into the crypt. The meeting was being violently interrupted by the Parisian market women, the Poissardes of Paris. Their footfalls resounded down the steps as they surged into the crypt, and they yelled, "Down with the red bonnet, down with the Jacobin." The market women assaulted the militants, who only just managed to escape from the crypt, fleeing westwards to the safety of the section offices of the Halles au Blé. That's the local government ward offices on the nearby Rue Coquillière. The Poissardes pursued the club members, but not before they had torn and smashed up the society's emblems, including its banner, which is emblazoned with the all-seeing eye of revolutionary surveillance. This event marked the breakup of the famous Women's Political Society during the Terror in the French Revolution. The history of the society, of course, tells us a lot about gender and politics in revolutionary France. But the way in which the club met its demise on the 28th of October, 1793, and the rather truncated description I've given is based on an eyewitness account which was published in the press at the time, reminds us that revolution, contentious politics, conflict all occur in a physical space. It doesn't take much imagination to imagine the chaos, the flailing fist, the panic scrambling of feet, the noise of running and the angry shouts and screams as the Parisian militants and the Poissardes grappled with each other, the cacophony all the louder because it took place in the confined space of a crypt. And this is the Church of Saint-Eustache today. Incidentally, it's well worth a visit. It's a beautiful piece of Gothic architecture, although, as you can see, it's got later additions. And it was the first Paris church to be built in Paris when the city burst the bounds of the Ile de la Cité in the center. It's a wonderful piece of Gothic architecture, soaring inside, and it's empty compared to the tourist jam around Notre Dame. It's kind of like an architectural tongue sticking out at Notre Dame. It's a wonderful place of it. And incidentally, if you're an early modernist, It's also where Jean-Baptiste Colbert, Louis XIV's great minister, is entombed. Anyway, a bit of touristic propaganda for you there. The venue alone tells us something about the political and cultural transformation that had taken place in France since 1789. Since the building was now, along with 10 to 15% of all other property in France, had been church land, church property, and had been nationalized by the revolutionaries. That the revolutionary women embellished one of the spaces that thus became available for public use with their political symbols also tells us something about how the adaptation of the built environment by the revolutionaries was as much a part of the transformation in political culture as other forms of visual imagery, rhetoric, and discourse that many historians of the French Revolution have identified as being central to the transformation in political culture of the French Revolution. And the role of the market women in scattering the women's political society shows that urban topography was part of the conflict. Church of Saint-Eustache was very close to the food markets and clothing markets, and there's the Halo Blé, the new grain market built in the 1760s. So the choice of Saint-Eustache for the women's political society, right by the food markets of Les Halles, the central Parisian markets, the belly of Paris, as Zola later called it, is crucial because it is a geographical juxtaposition of conflicting interests. On the one hand, there are the militants demanding the full application of the measures of terror, the economic measures of terror, the maximum on prices, the death penalty for hoarders, amongst other things. On the other hand, you have the market women, for whom the vagaries of supply and demand and the maximum on prices put them under intense pressure and potentially under the scrutiny of the revolutionary authorities. And moreover, they resented being under the scrutiny of the revolutionary Republican women in close proximity. And for another reason, Saint-Eustache Church was regarded by the people of the markets as their church. It was a place where they went to socialize, where they went to gather, it's where they went to worship. The militant women felt like interlopers, telling them what to do, and above all, for a period during the summer of 1793, they had harassed women walking around the markets who had refused or had failed to wear the tricolor cockade. It's an episode remembered as La Guerre des Cocardes, the War of Cockades. So here we have at least three ways in which space was an important factor in the experience of revolution. Firstly, its adaptation, embellishment, and use was part of the revolutionary process itself, particularly as a transformation in political culture. Secondly, the geographical disposition of different political groups and social interests within the urban space helped to shape the conflict and the way it unfolded. Thirdly, the clash itself was a struggle for the physical possession, for physical access to a space, to a place, and over its symbolic use as well. Now, I have to confess that I originally came to these questions quite by accident. I embarked on this research primarily because it was fun. There are other reasons. I wrote a book called, as Peter called, Rebel Cities in Britain, an unruly city, the unruly city in North America, on revolutionary Paris, London, and New York in the age of revolution. And I was exploring these questions of space in a very kind of, I think quite amiable, rambling kind of way. And it was in the last phases of writing that I encountered the spatial turn. Oh, sorry, that was a bit premature. And the reason I enjoyed this work was because it got me walking around. Part of the research was done on foot. And here are my boots. The sole is now worn out. This isn't just walking around Paris. This is also London, especially London, and New York, where the distances are so much greater. Paris, of the three, is the most walkable of all three cities. So it's great fun. And I took inspiration from an antiquarian, in fact, who was writing about 100 years ago, called Georges Lenôtre, who went down doggedly, used the archives, and did the footwork himself, and tracked the sites and places of revolutionary Paris. And he simply said, the reason I was doing this because I just wondered, what was it like? And he was right to ask because Le Nôtre inhabited a city which had just been rigorously renovated by Baron George von Haussmann, renovations which were continuing under the Third Republic in his own day, which is why he decided to collect the records and the footprint of the sites of the French Revolution in Paris. But the spatial turn is something which, as you know and know better than I do, has been something which has now engaged certain historians and cultural geographers. So defining what we mean by space and place is a matter of engaging with some confusion because, not least because I myself have been using, I notice, the term space and place interchangeably. The theorists I've drawn on for this paper are, of course, Michel de Certeau and Henri Lefebvre, whose book I was trying to read on the train going to and from Stirling, and it's been both very interesting and inspiring and infuriating in equal measure. It's just pinning it down I found intellectually rather difficult. Historians such as James Epstein, Leif Jerram, Christina Parolin, and most recently Katrina Navikas have engaged with the problem in very interesting ways, and so too has our colleague at Glasgow in geography, David Featherstone. Now, Henri Lefebvre distinguishes between space, espace, and place, lieu. I'll come back to that in a moment. For de Certeau, place is stable, where the location of things are configured, each in its own proper location. Space, on the other hand, arises when time and movement act on place. These actions give place its ambiguity, situated in a particular time, and give it its successive context. In short, space is a practice place, he writes. Thus, the street geometrically defined by urban planning is transformed into a space by walkers, in other words, by people inhabiting that space. For Lefebvre, space has a tripartite meaning. Firstly, it is material. It's a physical place. Space was produced before it was read. Secondly, and it's been created so it can be lived by people with bodies, he says. In other words, space for Lefebvre is the physical environment, coming closely and rather confusingly to de Certeau's definition of place. Lefebvre then completes this tripartite model by adding that, after being produced, there are then representations of space, the ways in which physical space is planned and order imposed on it, and spatial practice, which is how people live in the space in both symbolic and material ways. And this is what I'm going to come back to, spatial practice. It's all rather confusing, but some historians have dealt with this in a very kind of, I think, rather good way. And Leif Jerram, a specialist in German history, the Weimar Republic in particular, has published a technical term, cracking article on this question and has broken it down for use by historians in a rather, I think, rather wonderful. And he says in a rather pithy way, space is material, location is relational, and place is meaningful. So after all, we speak of a sense of place, meaning we associate certain things and identities and meanings or memories with it. We don't really speak of a sense of space unless we're estate agents talking about how big a room is or something, right? And also Pierre Norat's gargantuan project about historical memory in France, ascribed to certain places, events, times, phenomena, are called les lieux de mémoire, not les espaces de mémoire. So following on from Jerram's pithy rule of thumb, I've counted 6 ways in which historians can use or have used space and place in their analysis. But I won't go into those. I can talk about them afterwards if you wish. I'm happy to discuss them. But what I want to do is to go straight for one of them, which is what Lefebvre calls spatial practice in the French Revolution. Spatial practice is place defined socially, where space is used by political actors and social and cultural groups, whereupon that space becomes defined in however transitory a fashion in a particular way. So a space like the Crypt of Saint-Eustache in October 1793 might become a gendered place, or a radical place, or indeed both together at the same time. So this talk will explore revolutionary spatial practice, how the revolutionaries took over spaces that they inherited from the Ancien Régime, from the old monarchical order, and used them for their own purposes. In doing so, however, they changed the space, physical space as well. They adapted them, they converted them, they extended them. They did all kinds of physical things to the space, as one does when one might buy a new house, one embellishes, one doesn't just decorate, often one might knock a wall down, so long as it's not a supporting one, hopefully. In their embellishments, in their installation of new institutions and of new people, of new officials, of new legal experts and the physical alterations into these spaces, they transform them from ancien régime places, spaces that had old regime associations, into revolutionary places, which are spaces which have revolutionary associations in both symbolic and practical ways. So that's what I'm going to explore. Now here, back to this slide, which I did rather prematurely. On the 11th of May, 1793, the National Convention moved from the Manège, Louis XV's boyhood riding school on the northern edge of the Tuileries Gardens, into the Tuileries Palace. It occupied the Salle des Machines, the room of machines, so called because the large chamber was where the mechanical equipment for a nearby theatre had been stored, a theatre within the palace complex. On the 13th of September, 1792, a report commissioned by the then Minister of the Interior, Jean-Marie Roland, a Girondin, reported that the form of an amphitheatre in a semicircle, and here's the plan here, is an advantageous form in all possible respects. Firstly, because the president and the orators, who should be seen and heard, and they would be here, seen and heard easily, would be placed at the center. And so from this very position, they would draw everyone's attention and gaze. Secondly, because the whole arrangement would offer to spectators, wherever they are in the semicircle, a spectacle at once grand, noble, and imposing. The ancients, as well as the moderns, have always successfully adopted this form. The point was that the new venue would be large enough to hold not just the great mass of elected deputies, up to 800 of them, but also thousands of spectators in the public galleries. Maximilien Robespierre had suggested a completely new venue which would house 12,000 public spectators. 12,000. The point being is that as representatives of the sovereign people, they would be there to scrutinize their legislators. In the end, the confines of the Salle des Machines could hold between 2,500 to 4,000 people, but the purpose was the same, to ensure the maximum possible political transparency. Yet the revolutionaries' intentions and political ideas could not be the only factors weighing on the spatial practices of the new order. For one, they were constrained by time. In a revolution, especially the French Revolution, events consistently outstripped the best laid plans. And they also had no money. They're at war. They inherited a debt from the old regime. So they have these great plans for these great building projects, but they have other priorities, financial priorities. These limitations combined with another crucial fact, that the available spaces had all been constructed for other purposes, namely those of the old monarchical, aristocratic, and ecclesiastical order. The revolutionaries were exceptionally energetic in removing the visible symbols of the Ancien Régime. And if you walk around Paris, you can see the signs of this everywhere. There, top left, Rue Saint-Martin these days, and it had been Rue Saint-Martin, and you can see where it's been chiseled out during the iconoclasm of the year 2, the de-Christianization, especially of the autumn of 1793. And here, stumbled across this quite by accident, is Jacobin slogan. I haven't found out what this building was for. It's on the left bank. The indivisibility of the Republic, liberty, equality, fraternity. The indivisibility of the Republic is a Jacobin slogan. So this probably dates to the year 2, to 1793 or 1794. Okay. Such embellishments alone, the daubing of slogans, the addition of symbols onto existing buildings, could not ensure that the spaces themselves were practical for the new revolutionary purposes. As the architects of the convention's debating chamber in the Salle des Machines found, it was necessary to convert existing spaces in order to create new revolutionary places. In other words, sites which had both practical new uses for the new order and symbolic meaning for the participants. This was not always an easy process because of the spatial constraints already noted, but also because of the contingencies into which the revolutionaries ran into or were embroiled in, namely war and terror. So for the rest of this lecture, I will go through the ways in which physical space affected the ways in which the revolution installed the institutions of the new order, but also discuss how the impact of the war and the terror added new pressures onto the revolutionaries and shaped spatial practices in revolutionary Paris. So, from 1789, the revolutionaries worked very hard to establish a new civic and political order. In doing so, they required new venues for the institutions that they wanted to create. The process began in earnest after the march of the Poissardes again, the Parisian market woman, to Versailles on the 5th of October 1789, and the following day, they dragged back the royal family to Paris, King Louis, and the National Assembly and the royal ministries trailed in its wake, all came and relocated to Paris in October 1789. The assembly itself, after a brief and rather disastrous spell in the évêché, the assembly rooms of the évêché, the public gallery collapsed under the weight of the spectators. Fortunately, nobody was killed. The National Assembly moved into the manège, and then as we saw later on, the convention moved into the Tuileries Palace. The manège is very close to the Tuileries Palace, so this places the executive very close to the legislature. The government ministries, having moved from Versailles with the assembly, took up lodgings in aristocratic palaces and mansions, usually close to the Tuileries as well, particularly around the Place Vendôme here. Still a very nice place to look at. There's the manège there. There's the Tuileries Gardens. Tuileries up here off the map here. This is the Rue Saint-Honoré, still exists, of course. The Foyon Monastery convent, which would become site of a political club. But this whole area was also filled up with government ministries. The Ministry of Justice was set up on the Place Vendôme in 1789, and it is still there in the same building. The Place Louis XV, now Place de la Concorde, and the Faubourg Saint-Honoré. So this part of Paris represented an interlocking of ministries, king, and legislature. In some blocks of this district, there were 30 to 40 public officials for every 100 residents. So this represents a transformation in the character of this neighborhood. Within Parisian politics, in fact, the transformation in spatial practice had already begun during the elections to the Estates General, the kind of royally convened as representative estates, which sparked the climax, really, of the revolutionary crisis, political climax, the revolutionary crisis of 1789. And naturally enough, when the Parisian electors met in 60 electoral districts, they met and they voted in the only big available public spaces available in old regime Paris, churches. This is the Church of Saint-Roch on the Rue Saint-Honoré, so not far from the map I've just shown you. Interestingly, until very recently, you could see pot marks in the stonework. It's now been repointed, and you can still see where it's been repointed. And these are the marks from Napoleon Bonaparte's whiff of grape shot in 1795, where he blasted royalist rebels in that rather dark winter, autumn and winter of 1795. Still there, and they kept it, and they finally repointed it. Anyway, that's an aside. Churches were a natural choice. They were habitually more than just places for religious observance, but also places for the community to gather. The district assemblies continued to meet through 1789 into 1790. So after the revolution starts, after the fall of the Bastille, it was not uncommon to see, alongside the crucifix, the images of Christ, the Virgin and the saints, arrive the secular symbols of the new order, including the new tricolor colors, and political and civic notices nailed up on the boards and on the doors alongside religious ones. There might be a guard even posted outside, distinguishable in the new National Guard uniform, blue and white with red piping. So the district saw a cohabitation for a while between the secular and the religious. This coexistence did not last. One of the root causes of the revolution was the severe financial crisis of the absolute monarchy, which paralyzed it politically in the later 1780s. In order to pay off the debt, the revolutionaries nationalized all church property, 10 to 15% of all land in France, as agricultural land in France, as we've seen. The impact on Paris was profound. The city not only had 6,000 ecclesiastics, it also boasted no fewer than 50 parish churches, 130 convents and monasteries, 12 seminaries, and over 60 colleges attached to the University of Paris, to say nothing of the various hospitals and hospices run by religious orders. Then, on the 13th of February 1790, the revolution abolished monastic vows. Now, it wasn't compulsory for monks and nuns to give up their orders at this stage, and many do soldier on, but a lot leave the convents, and the convents and the monasteries start to empty from this point onwards. Now, these vacant properties are national property. They can be rented out for all kinds of uses. The revolutionary order itself assumes them for all kinds of interesting new purposes. Most famous of all, perhaps, the Church of Sainte Geneviève now is the Panthéon, and was created as the Panthéon for the grands hommes, the great men recognized by la patrie, by the fatherland. Now a great woman as well. This year, one of my crushes, sorry, I'm being filmed. One of my history heroes, if you like, Simone Weil, was interred in the Panthéon. She was a great feminist, a great politician, reformist politician, and a great European as well. The Jacobins, and most famously, political clubs. The Jacobin Club meets first of all in the refectory and then in the library of the Dominican Priory, again just off the Rue Saint-Honoré, which is the large street on the right there. The Jacobins were called such in Paris because the original Dominican convent or monastery was on the Rue Saint-Jacques on the left bank. The Rue Saint-Jacques, so called because it was the road to Saint-Jacques or Santiago de Compostela. It was the pilgrim route. And so that it was strategically placed. So hence the popular moniker Jacobins. And the Jacobin Club, the Society of the Friends of the Constitution, more formally known as, meet here and take on the name. On the left bank, the Cordelier Club, more radical, more popular, more democratic in its impulses, takes up residence in the church, now gone, so I've given you a photograph of the refectory, which is still there, now part of the Paris Medical School, which has it's now gone, it's been Haussmannized, a darkened wooden vault, and a rood screen with statues of St. Peter and St. Paul on it. So this is where one of the most radical political clubs of the revolution was debating. The local government took over buildings in the cityscape. By the spring of 1793, I've seen a document in the archives which itemizes no fewer than 18 buildings, and I don't believe this is an exhaustive list. 13 of them ecclesiastical for its new offices, for tribunals, for National Guard barracks, and so on. So throughout Paris, the religious was gradually being squeezed out of its habitual spaces by the secular order of the revolution. The changes in spatial practice become more formalized when the new city government, the Commune, was elected in July 1790. While this marked the abolition of the 60 original districts, it also marked the creation of the 48 Parisian sections or electoral wards. Parisian radicals use the sections because they're angered by the limitations placed on the male suffrage. Women do not get the right to vote, and not all men get the right to vote. The poorest males are excluded because of the tax qualification. The radicals, including the Cordelier Club, militants of Cordelier Club, see the sections as the bedrock of Parisian militancy, of the democratic popular movement, later on known as the sans-culottes, and so it proved. In the politically hot summer of 1792, when the constitutional monarchy was overthrown on the 10th of August and the Republic proclaimed in September 1792, it was in the sections that the popular movement mobilized. By now, the sections enjoys a range of political and judicial functions, including a justice of the peace, a bureau de conciliation, a system aimed at reconciling, a kind of mediation council, really, a kind of reconciling warring families, warring neighbors, that sort of thing, rather than having to take it to law courts. A police commissioner, a civil committee, and a general assembly of all active citizens, a category which expanded very dramatically in the summer of 1792. These local institutions are at the very interface between the new order and the body of citizens, the places where the latter were not the passive recipients of revolutionary ideology, but also had opportunities to shape the new political culture and new political practices in their own way. During the Terror, moreover, as we shall see, their functions expanded even further. At any period of the revolution, the existence of the sections represented a kind of a movement, a spatial movement of political power and political authority away from the center towards the grassroots, if you like, into the neighborhoods, into the fabric of the city itself. One of the things I found was a list of 32 sections, or 48 in total, so it's not complete, dating from late 1792 or early 1793. And there are lots of examples as to what kinds of buildings they inhabited, the sections inhabited. There was, on the one hand, an arrangement which is quite diffuse. Of necessity, because you're inhabiting buildings which exist already for other purposes, you're not going into bespoke buildings. So you're taking over what you can. So the section of the Lombard, right bang in the center, in fact, that photograph I showed you, the Rue Saint-Martin sign, that would have been in the Section des Lombards, has its guardhouse on the Rue Saint-Martin, its civil committee around the corner on the Rue Quincampoix, and its general assembly in the church of Saint-Jacques-le-Majeur. So it's quite scattered through the neighborhood. More scattered still, the civil committee of Robespierre's own section, by the way, the Section des Tuileries. The General Assembly meets in the Church of the Assumption, which is still there. It's worth a visit. It has strong Polish associations, incidentally, there. But the police commissioner, the civil committee, and the justice of the peace meet in the storage for the Paris Opera on the Rue Niceise, so quite a distance away. You know, this is not a compact arrangement because they're having to take over spaces which are available to them. Okay, and even so, such uses demand a considerable effort at conversion, and they do so in all kinds of interesting ways. And I want to turn our attention to one example of how a building may have been converted and the difficulties that the revolutionaries confronted in doing so. In the section of the Halles au Blé, so the same offices where the Revolutionary Republican women took refuge in October 1793, you have a building called the Fermier. And this is called the Fermier because, the Maison des Fermes rather, on the Rue de Boulois, so here, corner here, and the Rue Coquillière here. And it's called the Fermier because it was the offices of the farmers general, the fermiers généraux, the people were charged with collecting the indirect taxation of the old regime. The building fronting the Rue de Boulois itself had also been owned by or leased by a convent, and it was a seminary for girls under the old regime. At the center of this space was a courtyard, and to this day it still exists. The building's completely gone, it's been haussmannized, but the courtyard still exists, and to this day it's still called the Cour des Fermes on the maps. And my wife and I visited that because there's like a rather nice crockery shop in there, which you can buy all sorts of kind of bistro brasserie style equipment, so it's worth, and they let you have a look in the kind of warehouse bit. Several problems emerged from the existing layout of the building. For one, it had not been designed for such large gatherings of people as an assembly. As the two commissioners appointed by the section of the Halles au Blé to look into converting the building for its purposes noted, the salubriousness of a large locale in which a large number of citizens gather demands openings and light. The existing plans allowed for only openings or two large windows over the internal courtyard, which in the medical thinking of the time would let in only unhealthy air. The revised plans instead show skylights in the vaulted roof of the building, both on the courtyard side and on the street side. Moreover, they had to divert some water draining through and getting into the building itself. So the revolutionaries kind of adapt the building and try to impose some kind of order on it. So there's the seminary beforehand. There's the Rue de Boulois on the south side of the seminary. That's what it looked like before. And what they do is they build into the courtyard. Right? And here are the bleachers, the benches. And what they do, and interesting enough, it's the 15th of Thermidor. It's 6 days after the overthrow of Robespierre and the Jacobin government. I think possibly this may be, the design here may be significant because people are compelled to sit down. Sectional assemblies, often people were standing up, there were chairs everywhere, there's no furnishings really. There was an effort, this is possibly a Thermidorian effort to try to impose some kind of order on the debates, to make it more sedentary, to make it more sedate, less militant. This is pure speculation, but the context kind of fits. Right. Okay, so a more formalized type of debate, possibly encouraged by the configuration of the space and the way it's converted. Now then, these physical transformations of, from the old regime to the revolutionary purposes helped to shape the changes in spatial practice that were embedded in the new civic order. Once religious, aristocratic, and monarchical places were now being used by political actors and groups who reshaped the spaces around them. And in doing that and in occupying them with their own activity, redefined them as places. This was replicated across the city in multiple contexts and in multifarious ways, but the experience was accelerated and intensified by the intertwined experience of war and terror. Now, the war, which erupted between revolutionary France and the Habsburg or Austrian Empire in April 1792, would engulf Europe, all Western Europe, within a year. By the spring of 1793, the young French Republic was being invaded on every frontier and was at war on every maritime coast with every major military power in Europe, except for Russia. There was an economic crisis that drove Parisian militancy, threatening the convention with further insurrection. It was part of this movement that the Women's Political Club emerged in May 1793. In the provinces, the introduction of conscription sparked counter-revolution, especially in Western France and Brittany and Normandy and in the Vendée. And by the summer of 1793, the Jacobin government was facing a perfect storm of crisis. And the Jacobin government took power as well because they were the beneficiaries of a purge of the Girondins, sometimes referred to a little bit misleadingly as the moderate Republicans, on the 2nd of June, 1793. And this sparked civil war in the major French cities. So the perfect storm they are facing is one of war, civil war, counter-revolution, social crisis, and the very real threat of sans-culotte insurrection. The response that emerges in a very ad hoc way from the spring of 1793 amounts to strong government, political repression, and stringent economic controls, all backed up by the threat and the actual use of arrest and execution. In other words, the response came to be terror. Alongside this, the Jacobins prosecuted the war with great energy to the utmost. An effort embodied in the Levée en masse, or the mass rising or the mass levy of August 1793. The Republic proclaimed Bertrand Barrère a member of the Governing Committee of Public Safety in August 1793. The Republic is nothing more than a great city under siege. France must become nothing other than a vast camp. And in Paris, it almost happens. Paris was pivotal to this gargantuan mobilization of human and material resources. It became, in effect, a rear zone city, supporting the war effort with its army of artisans and workers, women as well as men working at forges, benches, and with needles and thread in the makeshift manufacturers of weapons, munitions, uniforms, and other materiel. The impact of the spaces on the city was almost ubiquitous. The Luxembourg Gardens, here on the slide, was the most famous of all the spaces converted from an ornamental place to an industrial one, with 54 forges lined up again along the wall of the Carthusian Priory nearby. Yet other places resounded to the noise of bellows and the ringing of blacksmiths' hammers, and billowed with the smoke of fires from the forge flames, namely the Place de l'Indivisibilité, erstwhile the Place Royale, and now the Place des Vosges. It's hard to imagine this being a center of armaments manufacture. And the Esplanade of the Invalides as well. Ultimately, the Parisian manufacturers produced between 700 and 800 muskets a day, short of the 1,000 target set by the government, but pretty impressive nonetheless in a pre-industrial age. But this was just the dramatic tip of the iceberg. The forges merely produced the barrels. Other parts of the muskets were made elsewhere in the city. The barrels were bored on 6 barges on the River Seine. I didn't have a contemporary image, so here's one of barges on the Seine now, and one I took this summer while crossing the Pont des Arts in the evening, very beautiful. 6 barges in the Seine, each with 16 boring machines powered by water wheels turned by the current of the river. And these barges have really blood-stirring or blood-curdling, depending on point of view, revolutionary names. Sans-culotte, régicide, tyrannicide, républicain, intrépide, and the carmagnole, which was a type of sans-culotte jacket, but also from which it was drawn the name of a dance and a song. Each boat was laden with these machines which bored the barrels of the muskets. Then there was a wealth of further jobs to complete: polishing the barrels, making the breeches, boring the sights, soldering the tenons that secured the barrel to the wooden stock, making and mounting the firing mechanisms, and then the final assembly. These tasks were carried out in former Ancien Regime buildings right the way across the city: aristocratic townhouses and palaces, and convents and monasteries. And as we've seen on ornamental squares sometimes. Sometimes, depending on the process, the tasks were contracted out to workers in their workshops if they needed highly skilled workers, as they do certainly with making some of the firing mechanisms. Once completed, the muskets had to be tested by being fired twice, once with a normal load and again with a double charge, originally against a small test bed in the Hôtel de Bretonvilliers on the densely populated, but now heartbreakingly quaint, Ile Saint-Louis, in the very center of the city. I could list all these venues, but I'll bore the pants off you, and it will be exhausting and exhaustive. My plan is to pinpoint them, map them, to get a sense of the spatial distribution of the activities of the great Parisian armaments manufacturer. To use Leif Jerem's term, the locational aspects of the enterprise. After the parts were made, 880 workers, each mounting 1 musket a day, were divided between the cloister and several rooms of the Jacobin convent on the Rue du Bac, and helped to put them all together. Lots of different places for the final assembly as well. That was not the end to the war industries. Even greater than the production of arms was the production of uniforms and equipment that would absorb the energies of tens of thousands of Parisian workers from amongst the 40,000 hard-pressed artisans, especially women, who worked in the textile and clothing trades and which had been hit hard in the revolutionary upheaval. Right across the city, there were workshops of tailors, cloth cutters, seamstresses, hatters, leather workers, and cobblers whose skills could be turned to military purposes. Many of these workers were women who labored because their families depended upon their earnings for survival, even though wages were generally half those of men, and because it helped their artisanal households afford the small luxuries that were the comfort of 18th century life. Unlike France in the First World War, we probably don't witness a new surge of new women workers into manufacturing. This is because women are already working in Paris. One estimate, and a conservative one, is that by the late 18th century, 1 in 5 Parisian women work full-time. And that is a conservative estimate. In Paris, women's work as seamstresses, button makers, dressmakers, hatters, linen workers, polishers, as assistants to furniture makers, where they often worked as wood polishers, belt makers and sellers of ash, used for scouring to extract saltpeter for gunpowder, could all be turned to clothe, equip, and arm the troops. And it goes on. Workshops, large-scale workshops to cut out fabric, large-scale workshops to assemble coats, to assemble saddles, and so on and so forth. And there is more. Buildings are converted into barracks, military hospitals, powder magazines, store for raw materials and fuel, granaries and flour stores. The beloved Palais de Rohan, the site of where the Ancien Regime archives are held in the Archives Nationales in the Marais, was converted into a stables for the horses of the Army of the Republic. The beloved Tuileries Gardens were put under cultivation. It's a rather nice book called Eating the Enlightenment, which talks about this. And this is to say nothing of the environmental damage some of this activity caused. If you're interested in environmental history, the police records in the Archives de la Préfecture de Police have the papers of the police commissioners, and it's full of these complaints of locals saying, why is there molten lead going in through my front door? That sort of thing. Why is it smelly? What are these noxious vapors all about? What all this amounts to is that the war is virtually inescapable for Parisians, not just in the day-to-day economic and political senses, and in the enforcement of economic controls and conscription, but also in the very striking visual ways in which the mobilization of resources marked their cityscape, transformed its spaces from places with ancien regime associations into places of industry and war. And this reached right the way across the city. As we've seen, even the banks of the Seine were not spared. Now, inextricably linked to the war effort was the terror. How much time do I have?
About 11 minutes, I think.
Хорошо. Merci. Thank you. Exactly 100 years ago, Albert Mathiez, one of the great historians of the revolution from the socialist tradition, described the terror as a state of siege. There is today, of course, a very long-running debate between historians about why there was a terror and even what on earth the terror was, and if even we can use the term terror, because they don't use it until retrospectively, they talk about a system of terror, after Thermidor. But I think as a shorthand for our purposes today, this is helpful. The terror, like a state of siege, involved, as we have seen, a supreme effort in terms of the mobilization of resources, human and material. But also, almost by definition, maybe not necessarily, a state of siege involves the control of the population. And it may include the suppression of dissent and the arrests of suspects, those alleged to be disloyal. The terror was no exception to this. So the terror involved the expansion of the repressive capacities of the state, and with it, yet more transformations in spatial practice. Pivotal at the local, that is the sectional level, were the revolutionary committees. And I apologize for the blurriness of the image. The committees of surveillance, or science referred to as the revolutionary committees, were originally set up spontaneously in Paris immediately after the downfall of the monarchy by the sans-culotte movement to keep watch on suspects, on royalists, on priests, and on foreigners. But they were given legal recognition by the convention in March 1793, and they become the local linchpins of the terror at the most localized communal and sectional level. They had the responsibility for keeping a watch on out for suspects, defined with actually quite terrifying ambiguity by the law of suspects of 17th of September 1793, and on foreigners, which is, as Peter says, something I worked on now many years ago. They issued the certificat de civisme, the identity papers, without which testified to the civic virtue of the bearer, and without which one could not travel, get a job, draw a pension, or hold public office. And to be refused a certificat de civisme meant being classed as a suspect and therefore liable to arrest. In Paris, there was one comité révolutionnaire, or committee of surveillance per section, meaning that there are 48 across the city, embedded formally in, of course, old regime buildings. They represented the physical presence of the terror at the most localized of levels, the physical nexus at which the popular initiative represented by the sans-culottes and the coercive impulses of the revolutionary government itself met and intersected. In other words, they're the physical and political juncture at which the terror from the top down met the terror from the bottom up. There exists in the archives a quizzical inquiry by one such revolutionary committee, that of the Section de la République, asking the government where on earth they should put all the foreigners they've arrested. It was the bitter harvest of a succession of legislation against enemy subjects since August 1793. The committee had raised a rather thorny and lethal question: where do you hold everybody arrested as suspects? The answer, as you will have guessed, was to transform the spaces, yet more old order or regime spaces, into prisons, or maisons d'arrêt. There were certainly pre-existing prisons like the conciergerie, and rather annoyingly, I've lost my photographs, my digital photographs of the conciergerie, which I visited a few years ago. It's worth a visit. It's tragic but fascinating at the same time. The conciergerie, though, was specially reserved for people who were arraigned before the Revolutionary Tribunal. It was the antechamber to the Revolutionary Tribunal, which tried and heard cases of people charged with treason, or les nations, as it was called. There was also la force, and this is rather interesting. Just to the left of the photograph is the entrance of the Bibliothèque Historique de la Ville de Paris, which is if you're going to do historical research, it's much nicer than the BNF. It's lovely. It's in an old 18th century townhouse and was owned by a guy called Lamoignon, or Malesherbes, who was one of Louis XVI's last prefects of police. Very benign, as Thomas will tell you, quite benign in terms of the way he applied censorship. He also defended Louis XVI at his trial before the convention in December 1793, and ends up going to the guillotine himself. Very tragic in many ways, but it's a beautiful spot. But nothing remains of La Force, the prison of La Force, except for this wall here. That is the only trace here in the Marais. The fosse starts there and goes back to the right. Down there. There's La Grande Fosse for men and La Petite Fosse for women. It's one of the scenes of the September massacres. Anyway, I'm just showing off. There's also the Abbey of Saint-Germain. But these were nowhere near enough to accommodate all the new suspects. So no fewer than 14 monasteries and convents were converted into prisons, as were colleges of the University of Paris, former aristocratic townhouses, hospitals, and poorhouses. This conversion included, incidentally, the Scots College in Paris, which is just down the hill from the Panthéon. You can still see, it's now a secondary school, but you can still see Collège des Écossais on it, on the building. There were 4 times as many prisons in Paris in 1794 as there were under the Ancien Régime. This representation in bricks and mortar it represents the human suffering inflicted by the terror. The prison population expanded dramatically from 1,600 in September 1793 to just over 7,000 in April 1794. And conditions were appallingly squalid. One report in the archives remarks that almost all the jails are infected with the odor of the latrines because of their construction and their location. This reflected the simple fact that these buildings were not meant to be prisons when they were originally built. And just like the sectional assembly chambers, they were the product of a strenuous effort at conversion. In the case of the prisons, this meant hammering in stout wooden partitions, doors with locks, iron grills, and more. To cite but one example, the work conducted by the master joiner Caron in a complex on the Rue Mazarine and the modern-day Quai Conti on the Seine involved the installation of oak wood posts, partitions, reinforced oak doors, bars, runners, and door frames in the various pavilions and floors that made up the complex. The main prison seems to occupy the rez-de-chaussée, the ground floor, all the way up to the 3rd floor. Rather grimly, there's a women's prison in the back of the 3rd courtyard. There are offices for the concierge, a guardhouse, an office for the prison register. There are a couple of cachots with double oak doors, places of solitary confinement for rebellious prisoners, and so on and so forth. All this complex is known as the Collège des Quatre Nations. It is now the home to the Institut de France. That was a prison during the Terror, unbelievably. It was Napoleon who puts the Institut in there in 1805. So this place, which had been the lycée, the Collège des Quatre Nations, not lycée, the Collège des Quatre Nations, whose graduates included Jean-Laurent d'Alembert, the Enlightenment writer, Antoine Lavoisier, the chemist, and the neoclassical painter Jacques-Louis David, becomes a prison during the Terror. And I really want to know what David thought about this, because David himself was a member of the revolutionary government. He was a member of the Committee of General Security in charge of policing, a die-hard Jacobin. And I wonder what he thought about his alma mater being converted into prison. Maybe he approved, I don't know. He never says. But before we end, let's get even darker. J'ai encore des choses désagréables à dire. The unluckiest suspects arrested and held in such maisons d'arrêt, and whose cases were considered to be serious enough, were translated to the conciergerie, tried before the Revenue Tribunal, and often, not always, guillotined. It should be said that the tribunal actually acquits more people than it sentences to death. But the tempo of killing accelerates in the summer of 1794 for reasons I don't have time to go into. This is graphic, I apologize. The stench of blood on the Place de la Révolution, now the Place de la Concorde, unbelievably, over which the guillotine cast its shadow, became so unbearable in the heat that on the 14th of June, the guillotine was moved to the easternmost limits of the city, to what was once called the Place du Trône, what the revolutionaries called the Place du Trône renversé, the Place of the overturned throne, and what is today the Place de la Nation, the Place de la Nation. But moving the guillotine also required a new nearby burial site. When the guillotine operated on the Place de la Révolution, its victims, and those from the earlier September massacres of 1792, were tossed into mass graves and covered in quicklime in the Madeleine Cemetery just to the north. Today, it's on the Boulevard Haussmann, and since this is where the remains of Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette, and the Swiss guards who defended them are buried, it is now the site of a chapelle expiatoire, an expiatory chapel built during the restoration of the monarchy after 1815. It's worth a visit. It's now a national monument. You get in for pennies. It's fascinating. I once went in there. I stumbled on a royalist kind of ceremony, and I'm not a Jacobin, but I have Girondin-leaning sympathies, and I thought, ooh, I'm probably in the wrong place at the wrong time. I'm glad I wasn't wearing my tricolor cockade. When the guillotine moved to the eastern edge of Paris, east of Paris, the new cemetery was that of the Picpus convent to the south of the square. It and the chapel can still be visited today. A very peaceful place and otherwise throbbing part of the city. Remarkably, certain features from the revolution survive. The gate, the sliding gates through which the carriages carrying the corpses entered the cemetery and dumped the bodies into the mass grave. And there's a bit of a fence left, now covered with ivy, wooden fence left, which partitioned the mass graves from the cemetery proper of the convent. I mention this because, as a final point, the Picpus Cemetery was, even then, close to residences which, as the ditches filled up with corpses, became an object of concern regarding public health and probably morale. The government therefore began to investigate the possibility of opening up a new cemetery at Sablonnières de Montempoivre, much further to the southeast, outside, beyond what was then beyond the limits of the city. An official investigating the site reported on the 18th of Thermidor, year 2, that is, the 5th of August, 1794. That is, 9 days after the overthrow of Robespierre and his associates, and just as the convention was beginning the process of dismantling the machinery of the terror. In strangely bloodless language, the report on the proposed mass burial site remarked that the terrain, if a ditch was dug deep enough, and they suggest a Hades-like 54 to 55 feet, the new cemetery would be able to hold, chillingly, 6,000 to 8,000 executed people, suppliciés. There is something worryingly universal about such bland, direct language of government officialdom as it deals with the lives of its citizens. It is upon similar detachment of officials from the realities of the human impact of their decisions that the day-to-day running of modern oppressive regimes so often seems to depend. I'll just make some concluding remarks. What I've explored here, I think, merely pecks the surface. As I've said, I've explored one way, transitions in spatial practice. There are at least 5 other ways we can explore space and place, particularly in times of revolution. Space has an agency in that it shapes human behavior, even as people try to shape the space for themselves. There could be problems with conversions, as we've seen. The buildings taken over during the revolution by the nation, or if you prefer the state, were determined not by the specific requirements of the institutions of the new civic order, but of the old. So even where the space existed, it was rarely arranged in a way that suited a new civic order. So it required an impressive effort at conversion in terms of money, labor, and materials, but also in terms of thought being put into which arrangements best fit the revolutionaries' aspirations for the new forms of political practice. In fact, in spatial terms, of necessity, a sort of architectural symbiosis emerged between the old regime and the new, with the latter not so much creating new political arenas from scratch as trying to impose itself on spaces predetermined by the bricks and mortars of the old monarchy. This is one area, at least, where the French Revolution, in a physical sense, had to compromise with the old order. Space, in other words, affected the process of the revolutionary transformation in politics. There are other directions that need to be explored. For one, it is clear from the invoices of literally hundreds of cartons in the Archives Nationales that this employed a lot of people. The embellishment, the iconoclasm, the conversion employs a lot of people. I can't enumerate them. Somebody else needs to do this job for me or for us. They are artisans, they are craft workers, they are journeymen. These are precisely the people who form the backbone of the sans-culotte movement, and this offers up tantalizing possibilities. Understanding the scale of the transformation of spatial practices also helps us to connect the political and the cultural, the linguistic turn in explaining the terror, for example, to the social and economic, because it suggests a vested material interest of thousands of working Parisians in the revolutionary process itself. Another point to reflect on is that Paris, for much of the 1790s, was a city at war, a ville de guerre, as the revolutionary writer Louis-Sébastien Mercier wrote at the end of the decade. That Paris, and particularly Paris during the Terror, was effectively a rear city supporting the war on the northern frontiers, is not emphasized enough in the literature. And it may have explanatory power as we debate revolutionary politics, popular engagement with it, and the evolution of the terror. And lastly, the multi-layered ways in which buildings are used for multiple purposes, converted, embellished, emblazoned with symbols, emblazoned with banners, daubed with slogans. With the new administration, the new legal system, new forms of policing, new forms of political practice, the waging of war, and during the period, new repressive capacities of the state. Their embellishment with banners, slogans, notices, symbols, together represented a radical transformation of the streetscape or the cityscape. If you mapped it out, I'm sure one would find that for Parisians, no matter how hard they tried, the revolution and the daily visual reminders, visceral reminders that this is a city in a state of crisis and a state of revolution transformation is inescapable. And I'll finish there. Thank you very much.
That was hugely impressive. And all I can say is I was gripped for a solid hour and 2 minutes. It's okay by Mike's thought. This is really why we're all here. It's really why we enjoy university life. We have the privilege of listening to lectures like this. So can I just ask you to put your hands together and thank Mike one more time.